So the thing is that we need to advertise the new YouTube link.
Yeah,
Right.
I think we can do that. Like at least it will go over Slack, and we can do it on Twitter and stuff. That will be okay.
Okay, so you can put it on Slack. I'll put it on Slido as well because someone already asked about it.
Awesome, great.
There is the same message in the description of YouTube. Can we also test the latency to see if it's the same?
Should I put it on the Slack or?
Hello?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, the latency seems to be okay. That's it, I guess, right? Who should I make host?
Why don't you make me host, Dan?
Adrian. I'm also going to change the link in the announcements. And
okay, the one that says real link, is that the real link?
Yeah, this is the final one, right, Dan?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
Awesome.
posting it on Slido.
Awesome, thank you. Great.
Okay, I can put it in the Slack.
You're gonna let me know when I should hit the share button, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I shall stand by.
So I assume we should wait a little bit, right? Until everyone connects.
Yeah, let's just give it a couple of minutes here. We can even watch the viewer count.
Just give me a signal.
Feels like being in, at least in the movies when they show TV studios, we're gonna go live in like 5, 4, the red light goes on. You know?
In TV studios, they don't have computer science professors trying to run the AV.
I think I told Nadia this. There are some of these Twitch streams that, okay, let me shut up and not distract people. Focus. Should probably try to focus myself.
I don't know why my video is on. I'm turning this off for this session.
I guess you can share the screen now. There's no, yeah, there's no reason to not do that.
You sure? Okay.
Well, I don't see a reason.
Did I press share? Did it happen?
Yeah, it happened.
May as well push play as well. Just so you can see the whole thing, right?
Yep.
Can you see my presenter mode thing, which I don't know how to switch off, or do you see like just the one thing? That's just a slide.
I see a thing on top with a play button, but it's not distracting. It's fine.
With a play button?
Yeah, there's some play button on top, but it's fine. No one will see them.
Do you see my name? You just see the title, right? How to design talks or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Right. I'm just saying that there's like a ribbon on top that has some buttons on it, like on top of the slide. But
I see. That's just some Zoom thing. You know, I have a theory, which is I have a feeling that yesterday you know what phantom limb syndrome is? Have you ever heard this expression?
Yeah, when you have your leg cut off and
Right,
And
but you feel pain in that, right? Because
Yeah,
your
yeah,
brain is kind. So I have a thing. There is phantom travel stress syndrome, which is that, I mean, obviously we were not traveling, but this PLDI is next week, and so my body is like, oh, all the hassle about long distance. If I'm not flying, I was so stressed out about the travel. I think it's a thing. Someone's going to study
You
it.
probably have been to too many PLDIs.
I have. I know. It's just
Aside
like, oh, if I'm giving a talk, that means before that, there's like you're flying there. It's like, oh, you. I thought I switched off Slack, but I heard the Slack's ominous clickety clack. Oi.
Oh, okay.
Oh, maybe it was on
I think
Nadia's.
Adrian says go ahead, right?
Okay.
Should
shall I start?
Wait, I mean, I'll have to introduce you.
Right. Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Sorry. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon PLMW session number 2 of Monday. We have a very exciting program prepared for you, so we will start. And apologies again for the technical difficulty. We will start with a talk on how to design talks. And in the second hour, we have a very exciting panel prepared for you on charting your path. So I hope you will stick with us for the full 2 hours. So, but for the first hour, without further ado, let me introduce my colleague and friend, Ranjit Jala from UC San Diego. Ranjit is, a real staple of the community, has received many awards, probably most recently the 2018 Robin Milner Young Researcher Award from the PL community. And Ranjit is very famous for giving really great talks. And I have to say for myself that a lot of the stuff, probably most of the stuff I know about how to give talks, I learned from Ranjit. So I hope you will all benefit greatly from this talk. So take it away, Ranjit.
Okay, well, thank you, Nadia. This is very awkward. I've never, in fact, given a talk like this. Well, actually, except for my lectures. Well, anyway, thank you, Nadia, Milind, and Adrian, and Steve for this opportunity to talk at PLMW. I kind of obsess a bit about talks, and I want to kind of tell you what I think makes for a good talk, and not so much what makes for a good talk, but really a recipe that you should use in order to construct, sort of, to build your own talks in the first place. Okay, so first, let me just say a few words about myself. So as Nadia pointed out, I'm a, what is the word you use, Nadia? A staple. I've been advising students for, I'm quite surprised to learn, for nearly 15 years now. And here are some of my students. I'm very proud of all of them and all the work that they've done. These are the students who graduated, in case there are a few who are tuning in from home wondering why they aren't on this slide. And as pretty much all of these students will tell you, I spend a lot of time kind of going over their, going over how they should make their talks, and essentially the few weeks leading up to PLDI, when they have papers at PLDI, are a very stressful time for everybody, because we spend a lot of time iterating over our talks and over our slides. And why is it that I obsess so much about good talks? Okay, so I mean, some of it must be just some strange OCD psychological thing, but there is also a more serious reason, okay? The more serious reason why I obsess about giving talks is perhaps summed up by this gentleman who has a scary looking face, but has a very, excellent advice on the matter of doing research. So this is Howard Aiken. He's one of the kind of pioneers of the computing field. He designed I think it was the ENIAC, which was one of the first computing systems back in the 40s at Harvard University, if I recall correctly. And Howard Aiken had this piece of advice about research, which is, he said, don't worry about people stealing your ideas. If it's an original idea, if it's actually an interesting idea, you will have to ram it down their throats. Okay, so this was Howard Aiken's advice. This is not something, you don't want to keep your research or your ideas to yourself. If the idea is any good, you are going to have to do a lot of work spreading the word. Okay, and to me, a talk is the best way to spread the word. Okay, you essentially get a fairly large and captive audience, and I'll come back to the subject of large and captive in just a second. And this is an audience to which you have just there's so many things you can do, right? You want to inspire the audience. Why? You want to tell them about your new research. Maybe you want to tell them about some work you're doing so that you can recruit new collaborators to your cause. Maybe you can help you you're building a new tool, and you want to get people to come and join your community, help you add new features, so on and so forth. You want to inspire them with your ideas to convince them that this is a cool project that you should work on. Maybe you're building some kind of library and you just want to get new users for your library. And the best way to do that is to sort of show off what you're doing in your talk. And most importantly, another excellent piece of advice I got from a colleague at UCLA that some of you might know, Jens, is you should think of every talk as essentially a kind of job talk. It's like an interview. Every talk that you give is you're sort of showing off to the world a view of what you do, what you care about, what your sensibilities are, and what your values are, right? And this is why I really obsess about giving talks, and why you should also obsess about giving talks. So before I sort of get into the nitty-gritty of how to prepare talks, I really want to emboss this idea, sort of imprint this in your brains, which is, of all the things that you will learn in graduate school, and even if you don't go to graduate school as an undergraduate, you should make it your business to really learn how to communicate well. This is probably the most important thing. By communicate, I mean learning to talk and learning to write. These are the most important things that you will do, no matter which of the many career trajectories that you might follow, over the course of your life, right? This is just going to be essential, not just for teaching, not just for industry, not just if you're an engineer. It doesn't matter what you do. Communication is probably the most important skill. And this is one thing I've learned in my 20 plus years as a computer scientist. Okay, great. So that's good. Let's assume that you buy my proposition that you really must learn how to give good talks. This brings us to the question of, what does it mean to give a good talk? How does one go about giving good talks? And to me, there are roughly 3 pillars of being able to give a good talk. Okay. The first, of course, is how can you create good content? Like, maybe, what are you even going to talk about, right? In a sense, this pertains to what kind of research do you do, what kind of topics do you select to do your research, etc., etc. The second is what I'm going to focus on here, which is, I'm not going to talk about how to do research, how to create the content. I'm just going to focus on how to design the talk itself. So I'm going to assume that you already know what you want the talk to be about, roughly speaking. You know the content. And we're going to focus just on the 30 minutes or 1 hour or 45 minutes, whatever it is you have to produce for your talk. But there's a third part that is equally important, which I'm not going to talk about. I'll just have some brief pointers at the end, which is, how do you actually deliver the talks? Okay, so this is quite separate. So to me, there's content. How do you actually design the talk? How do you construct the slides themselves? And then how do you deliver the talks? And for the next half an hour or so, we are just going to focus on one aspect, which is, how do you just go about the business of designing the talks? Okay, the other two, they're easily topics worthy of their own PLMW sessions or talks, and I'm not going to focus on them really. Okay, let me just pause here for a second and see if there are any questions. So Nadia pointed out that I should probably break at various points and look at some questions. I got a question. Someone asks, what font am I using for the slides and why? Now, that's a fascinating question. I'm going to hold that till the end because it's a somewhat low-level question. It's a very important one, and I spend a lot of time obsessing about that. It's called, if you really want to know, American Iowa or something like that. Why? I like serif and I like the somewhat classic look of this font. But anyway, some of these things are rather particular to me. Okay, good. So let's return to the subject of how to design talks. So the very first thing that you have to do when you think about designing your talk is you want to think about, what is the goal of your talk? Okay, so I should make another kind of meta remark over here, which is that as I sort of, as I give you this talk, the talk is also an example of all the things that I'm talking about. Okay, I guess what is the fancy PL word for this? It's a self-circular, I forget what it is, right? But the talk is somewhat self-referential in that I'm going to be describing various things, and I encourage you to kind of revisit the slides after we're done, because the talk is kind of supposed to illustrate itself the principles that it's enunciating. So anyway, I'll call this out in the course of the talk as well. So anyway, the first thing that you have to do when you're thinking about your talk is you have to answer the question, what is our goal? What do you want to do? What is the aim of the talk? Okay. And so let me pop back now to my specific talk, that is this particular talk. What is my goal, or what was my goal when I wanted to design this particular talk? So as I said at the very beginning, my goal is to encourage you. The talk is how you spread wisdom, get users, inspire people to do your research, etc., etc. But there's also a secondary and equally kind of crucial goal. We want to spread wisdom, but without losing to Candy Crush. Okay, so the purpose to me of designing a talk is to somehow help the audience focus on the material itself. Okay, it's very, very easy, and it's like a billion times easier now for those of you who are sitting at home. You are one alt tab away from something that is probably 10 times more fun than this talk, right? There's a billion other videos you could be watching on YouTube. You could be going to Netflix. If you were at a conference, then, well, you would have to kind of furtively look at your phone screen and maybe eke out a little game of Candy Crush. But right now, your opportunities are limitless. Okay, so how do you, when you design a talk, eliminate these opportunities for the audience members to get lost? Okay, and so I'm going to kind of keep returning to this theme, because to me, everything that informs how I design a talk goes back to this question: how do I enable focus? How do I make it really, really hard for the audience member to kind of tune out? And dually, if they do tune out, how can I make it really easy for them to jump back on the wagon? Okay. Now, there's a bunch of wisdom, shall I say, that goes back purportedly to the ancients on how to design talks to, to allow people to kind of focus. And one of the kind of famous pieces of advice that is attributed to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, it goes something like this, right? So the way you design a talk is, step one, tell them what you will tell them. Okay, so like I'm telling you, this is how you should design a talk. Step two is tell them. And then step three is tell them what you just told them. Okay, so it's a kind of, a fault tolerant system. You sort of predict what you're going to tell them, then do the thing, and then you kind of tell them what you just told them. It's a kind of reinforcing thing. So, I got this advice myself when, I was preparing talks, but there were various things that I didn't find satisfying about it. So first of all, it is in fact not due to Aristotle, but far more recent and far less kind of pedigreed. This was advice that a pastor in the UK sort of wrote on, gave to young pastors at I guess a pastor mentoring workshop, if you wish, in a little essay called 3 Parts of a Sermon. And you'll see actually we're going to return to this topic of sermons later in this presentation. But the second thing that worried me about this particular piece of advice is, for those of you who've seen this particular meme on the internet, you know how it is, right? How to draw an owl? Well, first you start off by drawing some circles. So you draw, this is going to be the head, and then this is going to be the body. And then step 2, draw the rest of the freaking owl, okay? So it doesn't really tell you how to produce the owl. It sort of is very high level, and then you jump all the way to the detail, to the final finished product. So this is not super actionable. So instead, let's sort of turn this away, and let me tell you how I think about designing talks. Okay, so the very first thing that we're going to do, that you should do when you think about a talk, is once you've identified your goal, you want to construct a story. So think of it as the overall narrative arc for your talk. Okay, and I'm going to put this in quotes over here. Roughly speaking, the story is going to correspond to your outline. Okay, we'll see each of these in great detail in a second. Second, once you have an idea of what your story is, what your narrative arc is, the story itself is going to let you break up your talk into what I call individual scenes or sections. Okay, and finally, once you've figured out what your individual scenes or sections are, that's when you get down to the nitty-gritty of designing or developing individual frames or slides. Okay, so don't start with the slides first. We're gonna follow this progression where you first start with the story, then think of the scenes, and then think of the frames. And I will explain what I mean by each of these terms in detail. And like I said, this talk itself is kind of self-referential. We're going to follow this arc as we go along. Okay, so first, the story. Okay, so as I said, we've sort of hinted at this already. The way you think of your story, the way you design your story, is you start by identifying your goal. Okay, so the goal is ultimately the key 1 or 2 or 3 ideas that you want to kind of ram down, that you want to spread the wisdom about to your audience. Okay, so you start with this goal, which you can think of as this little house. That's where I want to go. And then what you want to do is you want to think of your story as a path, as literally a road or a route that is a path to your particular goal. Okay, so what is the story? The story is you have some kind of solution, some wisdom, some goal that you want to arrive at. There is some starting point where you assume most of the audience members are. And now what you want to do in your story is to somehow identify or carve out, design, develop, whatever word you want, a path to your goal. Okay, so now this begs the question, okay, very good, you want a path. How does one go about designing a path? What even makes for a path? Okay, and to me, the way I think of designing a path is kind of similar to what happens when, if I'm looking for directions to actually, 2 days ago, I guess we're all in the COVID lockdown and whatnot, but things are getting really relaxed a little bit in San Diego. So they just opened up the beaches, and I wanted to check out a new beach that I hadn't been to. And so I knew the name of this beach, and I punched it into Google or whatever. And the way you get back a path from Google is via a collection of landmarks, right? It says go there, then turn right at so and so thing. Then once you hit the such and such freeway, take a merge onto so and so thing, and you keep getting this sequence of landmarks, right, one by one. And these landmarks are how you kind of identify and how you architect a particular trajectory, okay, a particular path. Okay, and so in order to actually build up our story, what we're going to do is build up the individual landmarks that sort of show us that point that build the way along from the problem to the solution. Okay, so let's look at a concrete example. And like I said, I'm going to use this particular talk as my example because I don't want to drag in some other thing which requires some research background. So what is my goal? As I said, my goal was I have a fickle audience, or an audience that has at its fingertips quite literally access to everything that's on Netflix and everything that's on YouTube, and maybe you just got a $7 subscription to Disney Plus and you haven't seen the latest episodes of The Mandalorian, who knows what, right? So I have a fickle audience, and somehow I want to teach this audience about how to design talks where they can enable their own audience to sort of maintain focus. And so the way I'm going to think of my landmarks are literally this, right? My landmark is, first, I'm going to tell you about the story. Then I'm going to tell you how to break your story up into individual scenes. And then I'll tell you how to break individual scenes up into frames. And at that point, I will have given you my kind of design recipe, so-called, for building talks that help the audience maintain focus. Okay? Let me just pause here for a question, because before we jump in, someone asks, is there any difference in how one should design an online talk versus an in-person talk? That's a very good question. Now, I should say most of my experience is with online talks. And so maybe the world of in-person talks is quite different. Sorry, let me flip that around. Most of my experience is with in-person talks, and my experience with online talks is quite limited. And so I'm just going to hope that in-person talks carry over somewhat into online talks. But to be honest, for example, even this back and forth that we're having right now, where you can ask me questions on Slido, this is not something that we would probably have done if we had met in person, right? So these new modes of interaction are quite fascinating, and I just spent the last quarter teaching a class with this new mode of interaction. So I'm not sure if they carry over directly, but I think the vast majority of what I'm telling you right now does carry over. Okay, so that's my hypothesis. But to be honest, at the end of this talk, you will probably have a better sense of whether they carry over or not. Okay, great. So in order to identify the story, as I said, you want to find your goal, identify your goal, make sure you know exactly what it is you want to achieve with your talk, and then you want to identify the individual kind of milestones that get you to that particular goal. Now, you may ask, why did I pick those particular landmarks? How does one go about picking landmarks? What makes for a good set of landmarks? This is kind of crucial. Okay, so there's a couple of design principles that you want to make sure you stick to. The first of these principles is quite a standard thing from programming languages. Okay, definition before use. So typically, you want to make sure that you describe problems before you describe solutions. So in your landmarks, as you pick your landmarks, you can't tell me about a solution before you've even told me what the problem is. Okay, so you must always, for example, make sure you don't put the cart before the horse, as they say. That's what this little picture is showing, right? Describe your problems before you tell us your solutions. Give me high-level intuition before you actually give me some fancy definitions and formalism and some math. There's some just basic rules like that, right? So, of course, you want to give your definitions before uses, but there's yet another heuristic that people sometimes forget that's kind of crucial, okay? Which is the way I think about it is you want to make sure that you minimize bandwidth. Okay, so remember, everything goes back to, again, enabling focus. And I think of bandwidth in this situation as the amount of mental state, the stuff that an audience member has to remember in order for your talk to make sense. So what do I mean? Here's a little picture that should illustrate. So along the x-axis, this is just time, right? As I said, you want to put your definitions before you put your uses, okay? So imagine I do something like this, right? I define 5 different things, or maybe I lay up 4 different problems here, and then I tell you about 4 different solutions in the future. The problem with this approach is it's very high bandwidth. If you think about it, this is what the bandwidth looks like, right? At any point in the future, the audience member must remember all of these 4 definitions. So at this point, at this midway point at the 15-minute mark, I have to remember all these different things. And so it makes sense not to rig your milestones in this fashion, because that's too much bandwidth. Instead, what you want to do is reorder the definitions and the use so that at each point, the bandwidth is super small. I just have to remember one thing. Okay, so these are some of the constraints that you want to follow. The second constraint that you want to bear in mind, okay, as you design your landmarks, is what I think of as a V-shaped complexity. Okay, and I should say one thing. This is someone asked about, does this advice apply to kind of in-person versus online talks? I think it applies to both, because I think some of this also applies, for example, to writing, to just sheets of, when you write a 10-page or a 15-page paper. There's this notion of V-shaped complexity. And what do I mean by that? Let's, again, make a little graph, right? So as I said, the thing I obsess about, that you should obsess about when you make a talk, is preserving audience attention. Now, no matter how clever my fonts are, how slick my animations are, how funny my jokes are, how good my slide craft is, this is what audience attention is going to look like. Okay, over time, when the talk starts is when you have your peak attention. Okay, right at the beginning is when everybody is paying attention. And so right then is when you want to start with highest level motivation and things like that, right? If you have some really nice results, you want to kind of front load that kind of stuff right at the beginning. Over time, inevitably, no matter how good, how good I am, people's attention is going to, slowly drift off. That is one. Not just that, over time, the talk is probably going to start getting more and more technical about, it's going to drill into the details of whatever it is you're going to talk about. Okay, so you want to make sure that as you introduce the details, this is gradual. It's not sudden. You don't like drop off a sudden cliff. So people are kind of slowly going down the hill with you. And then over time, as the talk ends, once again, audience attention is going to perk up, because people are at this point expecting, okay, this is like a wrap-up message. Maybe I'm going to get some high-level wisdom or some nice high-level summary and consequences. So you again want to make sure that as the talk ends, you pop up a bit and you don't go into very low-level details at the end. You sort of pop up and you let people get back, people who you might have lost in the middle, but you can help them kind of get back into your talk. Okay, great. So the third thing I'm going to tell you about landmarks is that you should really think about these landmarks. One heuristic for knowing whether your landmarks are any good is that you ought to be able to reuse your landmarks as the outline for your talk. Okay, so I think of the landmarks as not just, there's kind of structuring your talk, but they're also useful as an outline. For example, here are my landmarks. And guess what? They were also my outline. Okay, so my landmarks were, I'm breaking up this talk into what is the story, and then I'll tell you about scenes, and then I'll tell you about frames. We haven't seen that yet. But this is a good thing for several reasons. One is that repetition is going to reinforce the landmarks. Okay, so it's almost like error coding. It's okay for people to kind of lose attention or to kind of lose their focus for a little bit, because once I come back to the outline, they'll again say, oh, right, this is where we were. This was the grand scheme of things. We were supposed to get from A to B. This was the sequence of milestones. I lost a little bit of track in what exactly Jhala was talking about with story, but no matter, I will now pick up again once he starts talking about scenes or frames and so on and so forth. Okay, so this kind of thing helps you it prevents getting lost. And even if you do get lost, it helps people kind of get pulled back onto the wagon, as it were. Okay, good. So to wrap up on the subject of story, the key is to identify landmarks. How do you identify landmarks? There's a couple of heuristics that I use. One is you want to make sure you put definitions before uses. You want to make sure you do that in a way that minimizes bandwidth. Okay, I don't have to remember like 50,000 things at any given time. Two, you want to make sure you have this kind of V-shaped complexity. So start with simple things that are accessible to everyone up at the beginning, get more detailed gradually, and then as the talk ends, once again, it should be pretty high level. And three, you should really stick to this heuristic. You ought to design your landmarks so that the landmarks themselves can be a kind of outline slide that would sort of pop up again and again and again in the course of your talk. Okay, fantastic. So that's how you pick landmarks. Let me now transition, and now you can see how the landmarks are helping. If people have forgotten, this would be a good way now to transition to the second part where you have already identified the landmarks, and now let's see what you do from then on. However, let me take a break and let me see if there are some questions that I should answer. So Animesh asks, how much should we think of inclusivity while designing slides? For example, use text colors that are, this is crucial actually. So Animesh, sorry, I just read the thing and I forgot to read the words out. Let me just read the question out exactly. How much should we think of inclusivity while designing slides? For example, use text colors that are friendly to colorblind people. So I think this is an excellent piece of advice. You must do this. And one way that this happens, I don't want to say it happens naturally, is you must, once you've sort of designed your color scheme and your fonts and so on and so forth, you should try and do a couple of practices, and you will get people who will tell you that either the fonts are too small, make them much larger, use particular colors, don't make contrasts that are not easily visible to folks who have trouble distinguishing colors and so on. And there are in fact lots of very good resources that I can, maybe I'll just add a link to the Slack on picking color schemes and fonts and so on that specifically address this particular topic. Thanks for that excellent question, Animesh. Okay, great. So now let's talk a bit about designing scenes. Okay, so what is a scene and how does the scene connect with the story? Okay, so to me, a scene is the following. The scene is essentially a very short path that's between two landmarks. Okay, so remember how we took the entire trajectory, broke it up into landmarks. To me, a scene is an individual edge in that graph. It's a short trajectory between two landmarks. Now, the single most important thing I can say about each individual scene is what is summarized, I think, in show business or in writing circles as show, don't tell. What does that mean? What it means in plain pictures is use examples. Okay, don't use large chunks of text, just use examples. And if you can have more examples, the better, right? If your talk is just a sequence of examples and pictures, that is fantastic. So specifically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you. My goal is to help you think of a scene as essentially a sequence of transitions. So not an individual slide. It's just think of it. The reason I use the word scene is I really think of it as an entire 5-minute segment, a trajectory that gets you from one path to another. Okay, that gets you from one point on your path to the next landmark. Okay, so don't think of a scene as a set of slides. Think of it as a whole sequence of transitions. Okay, great. And what is the sequence of transitions doing? It's going to build you up to your example. So how are we going to build up a particular scene? So here's how I think of it. Okay, so here's my recipe. The first thing that I do is, in fact, I work backwards in a scene. So what I do is think of each scene as comprising one large example. What we're going to do is we're going to identify a complete example. So think of the whole example, okay, that I want to show, that I want to convey by virtue of this scene. And how do I identify a complete example? Well, there's a fair bit of thought that goes into this, right? So one of the best pieces of advice that I learned from this, which was completely unrelated to making talks, it's a kind of generally useful piece of advice, comes from a wonderful book called The Little Prince, which if you have not read, you must read. One of my favorite undergraduate professors said, it's like 98% of all the wisdom you need to have a happy life lives in The Little Prince. And here is one of my favorite lines from The Little Prince, where it says, perfection is achieved, the ... says, not when there is something left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Okay, so to me, the ideal example is one where there is nothing left. It's just, it explains exactly what it is you want to explain and has no extraneous detail. Okay, of course, this is going to be different depending on what exactly it is you want to explain and so on and so forth, right? But once you identify this example, what you want to do is take that example and construct the last slide in your trajectory, not the first, the last slide. Like I said, we're going to work backwards. Okay, so as an example, imagine that the landmark that I want to show you is the Eiffel Tower, and here is the complete Eiffel Tower, right? So we're going to start by creating the scene's last slide. Now let's look at it. Does this show the essential elements? Is there, in fact, as the Little Prince might say, is it as simple as possible? Is there nothing left to take away? Does it fit nicely on the screen? If it's too large, that's too much, right? So you want to make sure that it's just, it sort of fits nicely and so on and so forth. Once you've sort of answered the question of, is it complete and is it small enough? Is it kind of perfect per the Little Prince? Then what we're going to do is we're going to build up the rest of the scene by slowly removing the elements. So what do I mean? That's the final slide. We're going to work backwards by slowly stripping things away from it, starting with the simplest thing at the very beginning. Okay, and what the result is a sequence of transitions that builds up to your landmark. Okay, so you want to start with the final example and then slowly keep chipping away at it, almost working backwards till you have nothing, right? Till you begin with nothing. And that gives you the kind of trajectory for how you want to show people the particular landmark that you're trying to build. Okay, great. So what's a scene? It's a sequence of transitions where we kind of show this landmark by example. Now, I have this third rule that I use, which is somewhat controversial, but I think of it as, I think it's a good heuristic, right? You know that your scene makes sense, again, to make this kind of movie making analogy, if the scene kind of makes sense without any audio, without any speech or any words. Okay, so it ought to make sense if you just show the images, just the slides one after the other. Do the slides on their own make sense as a kind of silent movie? So let me show you an example of a scene, again, by example, as I promised. Okay, so I had to give a talk at, I forget where, well, actually it was at a PLDI a couple of years ago. It doesn't really matter what the talk was about. It was, I had to, there was one individual scene where I wanted to talk about a particular data structure called an interval set. Okay, so this was the landmark I wanted to convey in the scene. The final finished thing that I wanted to show the audience was this notion of an interval set. And so what did I do? So again, I kind of designed these scenes. No keynote, no PowerPoint has been involved yet. It's just on pencil and paper, right? I'm just constructing this storyboard style, right? I have an interval set. And then, as I said, I first identify a complete example. So this is what the complete example just sketched out on a piece of paper looked like. Looked something like this. Like, this is what the final slide in my example will look like, right? There was something about represent a set of integers, ordered into a list, something, doesn't matter if you can read my handwriting or not. Then I was like, okay, that's my complete example. How do I sequence it into transitions? By essentially removing bits one by one, right? So this is the final slide. I'm going to delete the last line. I'm going to delete the middle line, and I'll delete the first line. And then we have the kind of the finished product, which was, I'm going to think of as the monkey test. Let's see if this even works. Please work. Whoa, it did not work totally. There should be some way to, this is supposed to be a little video clip. Hang on, let me see if I can get this video clip to work on PowerPoint, on Keynote. Click, click, click. Ah, there, it's working. See, data, you can check it out now, right? Data structure, 1, 2, 3 into intervals, and so on and so forth, right? So this was, this final slide corresponds to what I showed you by hand as what I sketched out. And then the scene was this sequence of transitions leading up to this particular thing. Okay, hopefully it made sense without audio. Now, of course, in this case, this particular example may not make sense because it was kind of detailed and there was a whole bunch of context, but I'm just giving you the general idea. Okay, great. So that's what a scene was. Sequence of transitions that takes you from one landmark to the next landmark. Okay, And next, I'm going to tell you about an individual frame. But before I do that, let us take a couple of questions. Anonymous says, this sounds compelling, but it seems that the same methodology could apply equally well to writing the paper. Excellent observation, Anonymous. You are absolutely correct. In fact, it applies not just to writing. In the paper, much of this becomes sections, and what I'm calling scenes and frames becomes roughly paragraphs, right? So the methodology applies very well. There are a couple of differences with paper. So the main difference in the paper, and this kind of goes away in this kind of new YouTube streaming modality that we're in. The main difference in the paper is that you can have hyperlinks, and you can say things like, go jump ahead and go jump backwards. So remember how I said this thing about remembering stuff? You don't really have to worry about that in paper, because you can just add a back pointer, recall in section 2 we said so and so, right? And people can, like, if they're doing it at least on PDF, on their iPad or whatever, right? You can just click, go and see the definition. Ah, yes, that's the definition, right? So some of those constraints don't really apply, because paper is not necessarily quite so linear. Nobody really reads a paper just from like page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. You can kind of flit around. So that, I would say, is the main difference. So some of those constraints don't apply, but the high level bit, which is you want to break things down into the outline and so on and so forth, front load things with attention span, those very much apply. And if you haven't, I strongly recommend that you see Simon Peyton-Jones's PLMW talk. It's on a YouTube thing somewhere on how to write papers. It is fantastic. And frankly, you can see Simon Peyton-Jones talk about how to crack an egg, and it would be fantastic. But specifically, his advice on how to write papers is amazing, and it sort of echoes a lot of this advice. How do you get good at adding animations? Adding animations and transitions at to your presentations? That's a great question. The short answer, to be quite honest, is, as with everything else in life, the way you get good at something is practice. So you just have to kind of practice, and do that. Now, that's one, I will say. A more selfish thing I will say is that I like watching movies, and I guess to me it's it's kind of a justification for why I like watching movies or cartoons or whatnot. It's like, oh, I can pick up tips on how to explain things and sort of do things with flashbacks and fast forwards and how to have, but I don't think the second piece of advice is really serious. I think that's just rationalizing something I like to do. Really, the way you get good at adding animations and transitions is practicing. But there are a couple of things that I will talk about, Anonymous. I don't know your name, but there are a couple of things that I'm going to talk about in this third section when we start talking about frames, which will address this particular question, like what makes for a good animation, what's a good transition, etc., etc. And so let's hold your question. Maybe we can come back to it when we talk about frames. Okay, so part 3, what exactly is a frame? Okay, so like I said, a scene is a sequence of transitions, and a frame to me then is what is on a single slide at a particular point in time. Okay, now if there is one thing that you should take away from this talk, literally, if there's just one piece of advice you should take away on this talk, it is the following. On a slide, it should be perfectly obvious what one thing the audience member should be focusing on. Okay, there should be, on a slide, if I imagine I was sleeping, okay, I've been sleeping for the last 25 minutes, I just open my eyes and I look at the slide, it should be completely obvious what I should be looking at. There should not be too many things. Okay, there should be just one thing to focus on. Why? Again, remember the mantra, which is enable focus. If there are more than one thing to focus on, I don't know what thing I should be focusing on. I'm lost. Candy Crush, here I come. Okay, or Mandalorian, here I come. Okay, so how do you design a frame to make it completely obvious what you should be focusing on? Okay, so there's a couple of heuristics to use. The first is, of course, be minimal. If there's literally 2 words on the slide, what else are you going to look at? Okay, being minimal essentially makes the focus obvious. So Jonathan Shuchuk has a nice talk on how to make talks. And I have a link to it later in this. I'll point you to it. But he has this, what he calls the 12 words per slide rule, which sometimes works and sometimes you have to relax it. But anyway, the simplest way to make sure that it's obvious what to focus on is to just make sure that there's no more than 12 words. Specifically, what it means is, now I apologize to all the previous and future PLMW presenters who have slides that look like this. Do not ever make slides that look like this, okay? I guess we're going to have to read some of this stuff on the slide because it violates the rules, but I have to kind of show you how the rules are violated and why it's terrible to violate the rules, just so that you don't violate them yourselves, okay? So do not ever make slides like this. What am I supposed to be looking at? There are like 7 bullet points. If I just woke up, I don't know which bar to be looking at, right? This is horrible. First of all, I don't like bullet points. Avoid them if you can. They're just, I don't like them. I don't know what I can say. But the only thing that's even worse than bullet points are nested bullet points. Just the despicable. And I don't know why Keynote and PowerPoint even let you nest 3 levels deep. It's just horrible. Now, this is one, it seems like a really OCD thing, but I cannot tell you how important it is. It really is, okay? Never ever wrap text around a sentence, okay? There is something very annoying, and there's actually research that I didn't know this, okay? I gave this talk, and then people told me, you know what, there's people, cognitive scientists, who've written about this. When you have text that sort of goes all the way to the end, and then I have to wrap around, it is very, very distracting to have to do that. Don't ask me why. It's just how the brain works, okay? It's just how the muscles in the eye, like, we do not like this. It's taxing, okay? So if you are going to have text, just make sure it goes from left to right or right to left, depending on what language you're in. But do not force me to do a visual carriage return. Okay, let's move on. I can't see that slide anymore. The second thing about building a frame, and this gets to the Anonymous's question about transitions and so on, is if you cannot be minimal, right? Sometimes, you know what, I need to put multiple things on a slide, like I showed you in that interval sets example a few minutes ago. If you cannot be ultra minimal, then at the very least, be incremental. And this sort of dovetails with the advice that I gave you about a scene building up to a landmark. Okay, so remember how when we had the Eiffel Tower, I don't want to show you the whole Eiffel Tower because that's too much. On each individual slide, I just want to show you on what the diff is that this one slide produces. Okay, so for example, let's go back to that same example that I showed. On each slide, the thing that the audience member is supposed to focus on is the diff that you had with respect to the previous slide. And you should kind of think about developing your, hang on, my screen has, I've gotten locked out of the, oh Lord help us. I've gotten locked out of my Slido thanks to an unfortunate password situation. Okay, so let's see how the slide focus is going to be on the diff. So here was my data structure to represent sets. Let's see what's going to happen, right? So it's going to move up. You look at that bit, then you look at that bit, partitioning into intervals. And at each point, the transition is what you're focusing on. So there's a lot of stuff on this slide, but at each point, what you were supposed to focus on is just the particular diff, okay? Finally, sometimes even that is not enough. You just have to have a lot of things and you need to have them all up at the same time. In that case, what you want to do, the way you want to design your transitions, is you want to highlight the focus. Tell me what I should be looking at. There's a lot of stuff on the slide. Tell me what I should be looking at. So to give you an example of this, I'm going to allude to this kind of children's book. There's a series of books. It's a kind of fun game that some of you might know about. It's kind of a classic thing called Where's Waldo? So in these books, what happens is there's this character. So look at Waldo. There's a kind of definition before you. So I'm defining Waldo. This is Waldo over here, right? He looks like this. He's got these big round glasses, this kind of striped shirt and so on. And the game in all of these Waldo books is you are supposed to find Waldo. So here's a picture with lots of people. Oh, are they at a beach? I guess so. It looks kind of like a beach. Check it out. There's a crab over there. But anyway, the job here is to find Waldo. And of course, it's not obvious how do you find Waldo. But guess what? As you're, when designing a talk, you want to enable focus. And here's how you highlight. There is Waldo. Okay, so there are various ways in which you can fade everything else out and just draw my eyes to where Waldo is. And I don't know how good the resolution is on the YouTube screen, but at least you can see the little hat and the little glasses. That's definitely Waldo. So let's go back to my good old interval sets as an example to show you how you might sort of highlight the focus over there, right? So here's this data type. Now notice, here is how I'm highlighting the focus, okay? And I'm using the same joint color scheme where I want to say that's an example over there, it's in blue, and this is whatever, it's connected to some data type. It doesn't matter what the specifics are. It's just this little blue shading there's a whole bunch of stuff, so I don't know what I should be looking at, but the blue is telling me focus here, look here, Okay. So that's pretty much it. That's all I'm going to say about designing individual frames. The essential thing is to make the focus obvious. Don't make me work to think about what I should be looking at. The easiest way to do that is to put very little up on the slide to start with. If you can't do that, then gradually build things up. And so you can just, the viewer knows to look at just the diff, the incremental parts. And if you can't even do that, because there's just a lot of things, sometimes there's just too much stuff, tell me what I should be looking at. Highlight the focus. Now, I should, of course, point out that this is the kind of, it's a very general recipe. First, identify your goal, find landmarks towards that goal. Second, think of your scene as sort of subparts from one landmark to the next. And once you've identified each of the individual scenes, now go in and fill in the scene by designing the individual frames that build up the particular transition. The tricky business with all of this is, of course, there's a kind of chicken and egg problem, right? Sometimes when you think you've nailed down the story, you've figured out the scene, and then when you're implementing the frame, you realize, oh no, I forgot to tell people about so-and-so definition up at the beginning. And so you just have to iterate. You have to like, right, that was a crucial thing. I should have thought of that, and I should have put it into my story. And you kind of have to spin around this a few times to get it just right. I'm kind of getting to the end over here. So let me just say a few more things. Let me remind you that, I've just picked 1/3 of the important bits on how to give talks. The important parts are, how do you come up with content? Hopefully there'll be other talks at this PLMW that address that. If not, there's lots of great resources that we can point you to. I just talked about how to design the talks once you have the content. The third and equally important part is how to actually deliver the talk. How do you physically, go out and give the talk? This is something that, as with transitions, as with constructing, slides and pictures, just requires a lot of practice. Okay, so one thing you can do is, watch other people who have given good talks. So there's a famous computer scientist, James Mickens, who's a such systems and security person, who's, I believe, at Harvard right now. And James Mickens is a wonderful writer, and he's just a ridiculously good speaker. I mean, it's he's like on another level, And so this a person called Adrian Felt, who is on Twitter, I saw this. I've met James. I don't think I've actually met Adrian. I just saw this on Twitter. Adrian Felt tweeted this. I asked James Mickens what was his trick for giving a truly funny and insightful talk, and his answer was, you spend 3 months preparing and study videos of other inspiring speakers. And it's just a lot of work, but that's how you really learn to kind of deliver talks. And there are 3 specific categories of speakers that I would advise you to think about. That obviously there's well-known computer scientists or technical people that you might listen to. But sometimes it's good to kind of pop your head outside the bubble. And the 3 categories that I would say is, first of all, preachers. So remember how I made this remark about the 3 parts of a sermon? Well, preachers are, they give sermons, they have to hold an audience, they have to kind of enable focus an hour, I guess an hour every week. And they are really, really good at it. So just like go and find YouTube videos of Martin Luther King speeches, for example, to get an idea of just, how one delivers talks. It's something else, right? Then, of course, there is politicians, right? And of course, now, not all politicians are created equal. Some politicians are better speakers than others. But once again, you should go and listen to some great speeches by well-known politicians. And the third category that might not come immediately to mind, but that is, I think, a fantastic training ground for learning how to give good talks, is comedians. So, there's just any number of videos that you can find online. You will just learn about how you can construct things so that you can hold people's attention, how you can pace things, how you reveal things without revealing too much, so on and so forth, right? So if you got nothing else out, 1, there should be 1 thing you should look at a slide at a time, and 2, try and listen to some other great speakers to learn how to deliver talks, right? So that's it. That's all I'm going to say. This is my general recipe for how to design talks. Let me repeat. First, find your goal and develop your story as a sequence, as a set of landmarks that incrementally build up to the goal. Then recursively, you kind of go inside and you build up each scene as a path between 2 landmarks. And then recursively, you kind of drill down and you think of you build up each scene by building up a sequence of frames that slowly builds up to the landmark for that particular scene, but where the focus is made completely obvious. Before I'll finish and take some questions. Here are a couple of slides. Well, I'll just leave this up here so people can take the link. So Derek has a very nice talk on specifically that focuses on how to give technical talks, and Jonathan Shuchuk also has a nice paper on how to sort of structure your talks. But these sort of offer somewhat complementary advice to the kind of specifically designing the talk that I focused on over here. So let me pop back to this, which is, I think, a reasonable way to have as a final slide, and let me look at some questions now. Let's see. Uday Khedkar asks, sometimes a great and enthusiastic delivery of a talk hides the message. How does one strike a balance between what is to be conveyed and how it is to be conveyed? That's a great question. You mean because the speaker, I'm assuming I'm reading, trying to interpret what the question is. I guess sometimes perhaps, Uday, what you are referring to is that the speaker is so charismatic, or maybe the jokes are so funny that people just remember the jokes and they forget what the talk was about. Maybe it was about some theorem, or it was about some compiler optimization, or who knows what, and people have forgotten what the theorem or the optimization was. They just remember that so-and-so had a funny joke. To be quite honest, this is not something I worry about too much. I'll give you a bit of an anecdote that explains this. So when I was in grad school, I had this, he's a very famous and distinguished graphics and robotics researcher who may be retired now, Carlos Secan, and he came in, and this was during the TA training class. And what he did was, he just came into the room, and so all of us, like 15 students sitting around, in this TA training class, and this gentleman, he came in, and he just got up and stood up on the desk. I was like, what's going on over here? And he just stood there for 5 minutes without saying anything. And we were all perplexed. And then he got off the desk and he's like, so I just stood up on the desk for 5 minutes. You know why I did that? And we were all like, no, why did you do that? And his exact words were, because now I know for the rest of your life, you will not forget this lecture. And that is your number one job as an instructor, is to make sure people do not forget, and I mean, in a sense, he totally made his point. I mean, that his point was, you want to be memorable above all else. And here's how he did it. So I think it's a good question. I think, yeah, I don't want to be, I want to give it full seriousness, but I think most people who give technical talks are probably not at that level that, I think they're at the level where if they can make the better they can make the presentation, the better it is for how well the message will be conveyed, just because people will be kind of sticking to them, will be kind of tuning in and not have kind of dropped out. What do you think about starting from the complete example? Sorry, I'm transitioning to a second question. Oh gosh. The second question changed before my eyes. How long does it typically take you to put together a talk that you're proud of? So again, I should say this has changed a lot over time, because now many of the things I'm telling you have been internalized. It used to take me several weeks. And I mean, it depends. Some talks take me at least 2 or 3 weeks. Some talks take even longer. But yeah, I mean, if I really, really want to make a kind of polished talk, we're looking at several weeks. And if you are a kind of a senior undergraduate or a PhD student, so I mean, recently one of my students is PhD students. He's a first year PhD student who, for all I know, is listening in right now. Is going to give a talk on PLDI on Wednesday, I think, in a couple of days. And I think he spent several weeks, I would say maybe 3 or 4 weeks, with several iterations, going over a talk that I was then proud of, right? I hope he's proud of it. I think it's a very good talk. But it took roughly 3 or 4 weeks. Wait a minute, the question has changed. Anna asks, how to avoid talking deep theory of the paper, there is never enough time for that, while also not making the talk sound shallow in terms of technical contribution. Now, I should say it's a very good question, because there's also I don't know what to say, a cultural aspect to this. What I mean is, in some places, people really expect to see a lot of kind of quote unquote theoretical depth, like definitions, typing rules, stuff like that. I personally always shy away from that. To me, if I can convey what has been done by example, that always is preferable to showing if I can, to me, I don't, okay, so this is, I should say, I should preface this with, this is my personal take, and different people will give you different answers. You should ask the other people on the panel, for example, this question. You may get very different answers, and their answers are equally valid. To me, the job is again, what is the goal, right? It all comes back to what was my goal. My goal is usually, when I'm giving a talk, to convey some particular idea. And as long as I have conveyed the idea, I'm not worried about whether it sounds shallow or deep or not, right? To me, that particular question that you're asking is a very good question, but it comes down to, what is my goal? Was it to show you that I have some fancy theorem? If so, I'm going to build up a bunch of examples that show you this particular theorem, right? But some people have this, and in at least American universities, there is this advice, and I remember getting this advice when I was graduating, that I got this exact piece of advice from one of my mentors, who told me that, look, Ranjit, you're going to make a talk, you have to give a job talk and so on, and the problem with your talks is everything looks very easy, and people in a job talk, there's a point in that talk where they want to get confused, otherwise people will not be impressed. I'm just quoting what this person says. I'm just quoting what this person told me, right? So I think this is what you're referring to, Anna. So I think the way, if you really, really have to do that, and in some places where you go and give a talk, people will tell you, you really need to do that. It just is. It's like, let's not question why it is, and it just is, right? And you want to get a job, and so you want to kind of show off a little bit. It's also possible to do what you're saying, Anna, by just clearly signaling that here is the part of the paper where I am going to tell you about something that's quite technical, and it's okay if I lose some of you. Don't worry, this will be kind of clearly isolated and walled off. I will probably lose some of you. That's okay. I promise I will bring you back on board after the fact. Okay, so again, if you go back to that V-shaped curve thing, you're going to say, I promise you, some of you, I might lose you now, but that's okay. This is just for the people who really understand the technical nitty-gritty about XYZ. It's for them. Bear with me. You do your thing. You get in, you get out, and then you pop back back up at a higher level where people can still follow. That's my personal recipe for addressing the question that you're raising, Anna. How do you actively listen? Anonymous asks, how do you actively listen to and learn from other great speakers and map it into your model of story, scene, and frame? Well, so I think it's an interesting question, because I would say the answer is almost in the question. So in my head, the rubric that I have is the story, scene, and frame. And so when I watch, say, a stand-up routine, or if I watch James Mickens give a talk, what I try and do is I kind of deconstruct from that talk, because the story, scene, and frame is not made explicit, right? That this is a frame, this is that, right? So what I try to do is I try to, it's almost like I'm doing a field study where I look at the talk and I'm like, what was their, what do I think their goal was? What do I think they are breaking? How are they breaking up their narrative arc into the individual landmarks, and what's going on with individual scenes and frames? So the reason I say the answer is in the question is because I've sort of internalized what my definition of what story, scene, and frame are, and I hope the slides have conveyed some sense of that to you. And then when I watch these other people give their talks, I try and reverse engineer what that is, right? And it gives me more and more exemplars of different ways in which you can construct the story, the different scene, and the different frames. So it's almost like Eran's talk, I guess. We're all neural networks. So in a sense, I have this thing of story, scene, and frame, and I'm just kind of trying to train my own classifier to, what is this? What is the story here? What is the scene here? What is the frame here? And I'm building up, I have my own narrow thing, and then as I see more and more examples, I'm building up a repertoire of different ways in which you can structure stories, you can structure scenes, and structure frames or animations, and so on. Any tip? Theo asks, any tip regarding timing? What about answering questions in person, online? So Theo, that's a great question. So in many situations, this will be out of your hands. So for example, if this was, if we were all in London right now, then usually we would have held, if you were giving, a talk, usually they ask that you hold the questions to the end so as to not interrupt other people, because it's kind of an interruption, if it's in a live talk. If it's live streamed, it's different, right? Because you can have this separate bandwidth and so on. I personally, it's somewhat up to the speaker, right? I personally like interactive talks. When I lecture, it's just a constant stream of digressions based on what questions people are asking. But there is a balance there, right? You want to kind of make sure that you don't lose everybody just because you're digressing on random things. So in a lecture, that's okay, because like with paper, you can kind of go forwards and backwards. With a thing where there's a kind of tight linear arc that's already been imposed by the format, I think what works best is what Nadia, who's the chair of this session, suggested, which is to have specific points which are kind of transition points, which were for the particular talk that we just did. This bit where I was going from motivation to story to scene, and kind of break there and take some questions. I thought that worked pretty well. Anonymous, do you think it is important to research the audience, for example, talking about the same work? Oh, absolutely, that's crucial. So this goes back into the topic of goal. So sorry, I didn't read out the question. For example, if you're talking about the same work at an academic conference or to a group of industry folks, you might present the talk quite differently. In fact, your goal would be very different. If I'm giving a talk to, even at the same academics, right? If I'm giving a talk about some material to a set of experts on a particular topic, then I can assume a lot of shared background. I don't have to explain to them, every little thing, because they know all that, right? I can cut to the more bits that are quote unquote novel for them. While if I'm talking to a more general audience, then I have to provide more background. If I'm talking to, say, a more industry focused audience, then I have to maybe give you some more motivation. I can't just assume. So I work on, say, formal verification, right? I can't assume everybody believes that formal verification is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I have to give you some background about that. Yeah, so the audience is crucial. And to me, this is factored in your identifying the goal. What is it that you want to convey? Do you want to convey some clever typing rule? Do you want to tell people about your system? Do you want to tell people about how to use a particular tool, and so on? And also the set of landmarks that you're going to choose in order to arrive at that goal. Anonymous asks, by the way, Nadia, I assume you will stop me at some point if I'm over time, or maybe.
Since we started late, I thought we can go until 1/4 past. So we have like 2 minutes, but you can stop at any point before that.
Okay, no, sure. I mean, I just want to make sure someone's going to ping me. It's not like this is a super hard question that I'm trying to avoid. Okay, so let's see. What do you think about starting from the complete example and deconstructing it in the flow of the talk, not just in the talk design phase? I'm not sure I follow this question. Do you mean like show the audience how you broke down the question? I guess this is a bit tricky. This would be easier with like a live Q&A. So I'm not really sure. I'll tell you what, I'll let Anonymous yeah, I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean like interactively deconstructing it in the, I guess that's what you mean, right? I mean, I'll just give you my best interpretation of your question. So I think the way I think about making a talk is you first just do everything on pencil and paper. You kind of deconstruct the arc, etc., etc. And then in the talk itself, often you, in fact, do what you're suggesting, right? You take the example and you break it down and you sort of build it up. Sometimes it works well even to show people the whole thing and sort of break things up one by one. Oh, I see, just show it forwards. Yeah, that can work too. The trouble with it is you want to make sure that people are not too intimidated when they see the whole example up front all at once. If they see that, they're like, oh my God, what just happened? This is so complicated, right? So you can tell people, look, don't worry, I'm showing you this big chunk over here, but you don't have to pay attention to it. I will gradually reveal the small parts of it as we need to go. And that works sometimes quite well. I've done that often. Not a question.
I think we're out of time.
Okay, sounds good.
At this point, so let's thank everyone. Let's thank Ranjit with a round of applause. So I'll applaud on audio, but you can applaud, of course, on Slack. This was a super enlightening talk. As Ranjit, you will see some comments on Slack about that, and I assume Ranjit will stick around on Disco, where you can also talk to him after the session.
Will do. Thank you.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Ranjit.
Let me. I stop share, right? I stop share and switch off my video somehow.
That's it. So at this point, we will transition to a panel. So I want to ask panelists to enable their video so that we can have the gallery view of everyone. Let me also do that. All right, this is great. Okay, so we have everyone here. All right, let's start with the panel. Our panel is on charting your path. So basically the idea behind this panel is to discuss the various career opportunities and possible paths that you have as a researcher, or let's say after grad school. We have 4 amazing panelists with us today. We have Alexander Silva from University College London, Steve Friend from Williams College, Madan Musavati from Microsoft Research, and Loris D'Antoni from University of Wisconsin-Madison. And they will first introduce themselves, and as you will hear, they basically represent several different career paths that that are available to you after you've done your PhD. And the idea is that after this brief round of introductions, you can just ask them questions via Slido about their paths and sort of, you know, the pros and cons and how you would go about trying to get on that. So, all right, so now without further ado, I don't have any specific order in which I wanted to introduce ourselves. So maybe let's start with Alexandra.
Okay, thanks, Nadia. So my name is Alexandra Silva, and I'm a professor at University College London. I guess my path might look standard from the outside, but in fact, a lot of it happened by chance and by external factors. I did a PhD because one of my best friends was doing a PhD in Amsterdam, and I was about to take on an industry job, and last minute decided to give a go to grad school. Later on, I did a postdoc in the US and considered actually staying. And then last minute again, I applied for a job in Europe and got it a bit unexpectedly. So I went back to Europe and have been doing my academic career there since. So I'm happy to elaborate on some of the maybe non-standard choices I made, even though they might look like a straight path from the outside, but it definitely hasn't been. So I'll pass it on to Stephen.
Hi, thanks. Microphone problems here. Can you guys hear me? Great, thanks. Thanks for having me on this panel. It's really a pleasure to be here. My name is Stephen Friend. I'm a professor of computer science at Williams College. Williams is a small selective liberal arts college of about 2,200 undergraduates in Massachusetts. For those not familiar with the liberal arts model, we have no graduate programs. It's entirely undergraduate. And our core mission is to educate our students in the broadest sense of the word, and with an emphasis on critical thinking, communication, and reasoning skills. I actually started at a pretty different type of institution. I was an undergraduate at Stanford University. But there were 2 parts of my undergraduate life there that really impacted my career. One was being a TA for the introductory classes for many semesters, and the other was being involved in research dedicated to building programming tools for use by introductory students. Those piqued my interest in programming languages, and I continued on in that work in graduate school, also at Stanford with John Mitchell, and also in my first career after Stanford, which was spending 2 years at the Systems Research Center. This was a corporate research lab in Palo Alto, originally owned by DEC and then Compaq, then by HP as these companies bought each other. After a couple of years there, and I'm happy to elaborate on this over the course of the hour, I just felt like perhaps academia would be a better environment for me. And I specifically looked for places like Williams where I can balance teaching and research, and especially focus on undergraduate education. I am active in research, even though I'm at an undergraduate institution. I have spent my career focusing on program analyses for concurrent programs, that is identifying race conditions or atomicity violations. And it draws on dynamic analyses and static analyses. And one of the parts I really love about it is that I get to do everything. I formulate the problem, I develop the theory, I build the systems, and I validate the systems.
How about we continue with Madan?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking the PLMW organizers for having me here. So I'm Madan Musavati from Microsoft Research. and my research interests lie broadly in programming languages and systems. I did my PhD in Stanford, and when I graduated, joining an industrial research organization like Microsoft Research was my dream job. And I've been in MSR for 16 years, and I've loved every day of it. And I would, so just to give you an like an introduction, like Microsoft Research is, it's an open-ended research organization. We, we do, we very much do research very similar to what you would see in, in academic institutions. We can go after problems that we care about, and we encourage our researchers to do, to create meaningful impact, both externally and within Microsoft and the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Madan. Loris, can you introduce yourself? Oh, we can't hear you, Loris. We cannot. Maybe you can try a different.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi, so I'm Loris Antonio. I'm an assistant professor in the MedPL group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I work mostly on program synthesis and program verification. So before this, I was a first-generation college student in Italy. I mean, in that, like, nobody in my family had gone to college, so I didn't know anything about anything. The reason I ended up going to academia is just I was very lucky that my undergraduate advisor picked me up when I was a student and said, hey, you want to do some research? And I say, I don't know what that is, but why not? And then from then on, essentially, I started really liking research. I didn't even know what it was. I wasn't really particularly interested in it at first. And then she put me in touch with people in the US, and I ended up doing my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, where I ended up actually finding the type of work that I'm doing now that I really like. And so I guess, yeah, I'm now a professor in the United States. So I guess that's partly what I'm representing here at the research institution. And I had no idea I would have ended up here or even in this career path at first. So I wish that when I was an undergrad, I had an event like this for learning about it.
All right, great. Thanks for the introductions. So we'll proceed with questions from Slido. So some of them seem to be directed more towards one of the panelists, and others are more general. Yeah, so for future Slido questions, please, if you want to direct them to a particular person, just put that as part of the question, okay? All right, the first question seems to be just more general. How far ahead did you plan your career path to get where you are? Just whoever wants to take that.
Okay, I can take it. I didn't plan very far, but I think, like Loris, I was first generation, and so I didn't have a very close support network in the family that would allow me to plan ahead. When I was in grad school, PLMW didn't exist, though I was lucky enough to have a lot of informal mentors along the way, and that has definitely helped me massively. In terms of planning, I think you can plan a bit, but to be honest, the more you plan, the more disappointed you might be in the end. So my advice is, do what you like research-wise, and try to work around constraints in the rest of your life, really, when you look for a job. But too much planning, I don't think is, at least for professor jobs, it will not give you more certainty in landing the job you want. There's so many external variables that I think too much planning might actually be bad for oneself.
Thanks, Alexander. Anyone else want to chime in?
So I completely agree with Alexander here. I think, at least me personally, my career has been a series of fortunate accidents. It's you sort of know in general that you want to pursue a career in research, but then the specifics are very difficult to predict. And more importantly, I think you need to be open to serendipitous events, right? So if you're more flexible, you can take advantage of the opportunities that come in front of you. And so I think, so yes, it's very difficult to predict the future.
Madan took a lot of the words I was going to use, but I share the same sentiment. You can sort of point yourself in a direction that you think is going to work well, but serendipity is going to play a part in it. The thing to do is prepare yourself to recognize when that happens and understand what you like about certain decisions, or to give yourself a context for making them effectively. And by that, I mean, part of preparing for your career path, no matter what it is engaging in activities like the workshop today, talking to people at PLDI, reading lots of papers from lots of different areas, and taking advantage of every resource that you have to better understand what you're excited about and what you're not excited about. So that when there are those moments when you have a choice between alternatives, you can be confident that you're going to continue pointing yourself in the right direction. And it doesn't always work that way. An example from my own career, at the end of graduate school, I did what all my friends at Stanford were doing. I applied to the top 20, 30, 40 research universities. And I went through that process and just was not excited by it. Going to the research lab was really something that I felt I could do effectively and would enjoy. I had already worked there for a couple of years. And I have absolutely great colleagues that I still work with from that lab. It turns out that after a year, I started to recognize what I valued more, which was being in an academic community. And I started to realize that I really missed working with undergraduates. And then applying for jobs like the one at Williams, where I am now, was just sort of a natural progression. So I didn't really prepare for being at a liberal arts college. I actually had no idea what a liberal arts college was when I was at Stanford. But I had I reflected on what I was doing and tried to understand where I wanted to be. And that's what sort of guided me along the path.
Thanks, Steve. Loris, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Just double checking.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, one thing I want to add is I have to say I didn't know what I was doing a lot throughout my path, so I wouldn't say expertly prepared. But one thing that helped a lot was just being very active in various things. So it's like being active at conferences, trying to talk to people, getting out of your comfort zone. Like when I was going to conferences as a graduate student, I remember the first conference I went to, I asked my advisor, who is famous, who should I talk to? Who is an interesting person to talk to at this conference? And he gave me some names, and I kind of just, during the conference dinners, just went straight to the table where this person was sitting because I wanted to talk to them. And did kind of a couple of things like this, just trying to force myself to talk to people that were interesting. And a lot of these random encounters ended up turning into some kind of opportunities. And for example, I did an internship at Microsoft Research that was perhaps a very crucial turning point of my career, where I opened my path towards different directions. And so I think just this idea of being there, like being present when you go to various events, trying to meet various people, is really, I would say that the part that I underestimated when I started was the importance of just the community aspect of the work. Like you need to be around to hear what's happening. So maybe that's my other advice.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. There's a couple of questions about basically directed to Madan about differences between industry and academia research. So I'll just read them out together. How would you evaluate the difference between a career in academia and a career in industry organization like Microsoft Research? And another related question is, how much freedom does Microsoft provide at MSR? Is there some business impact justification required for the work done?
Okay, so by the way, I just wanted to point out that there was a higher rank question for which that literally made me smile. That I
wanted to save it for later.
Okay, sure. So let Nadia deal with that. So about MSR, yes, you do have a lot of freedom. so part of my job is very similar to everybody else when it comes to doing research. You have absolute intellectual freedom in pursuing your own direction of research. And, we essentially want to be peers with, in the academic community that you're part of. So essentially MSR's mission from the very beginning has been to to extend the state of the art and to essentially, use your research and your thought leadership to impact the company, impact Microsoft, and actually not just Microsoft and the rest of the world. And so there's a lot of emphasis in pushing your research to its logical end, to create viable systems, making them open source and helping the company. And so yes, I get this question a lot of the time, as in hey, do you have absolute freedom to do whatever you want? The short question is yes. Do you have to do a business impact? The answer to that is also yes. And it is like asking the question about whether you can do research or to do business impact. I mean, that is like a false choice to me. If you're doing groundbreaking research, there has to be a way to change the world. And if you're changing the world, I think you're having a lot of impact. And so that's what we look for. So hope I have answered this question. I'll be happy to, if there are clarifications, I'll be happy to delve further.
Thanks, Madan. Okay, I have to address this most popular question on Slido, directed to Steve. Steven, is that a dog or a rug?
Well, it can.
Okay, now we know. All right, so there are a couple of questions about PhD programs in particular. So one is, what things should I be looking for in a PhD program? And during a PhD, how do you measure how well you're doing? I think those are related. Maybe, I don't know, whoever wants to take that, maybe Loris or someone from academia.
So which one was the first question? Is this, what do you look for in a PhD program?
What do you look for in a PhD program, and how do you measure your program?
It's I mean, what to look for, I guess, at application time. I mean, this is a bit of a tricky question because every student is a bit different. So some students have had zero exposure to research in their undergrad. And so this makes it a little harder because you will want to go to a great place, essentially, where you can do great work. Some people, I think, have more specific ideas in mind. So it's like they want to work on a very specific topic. We can talk more about this later. I think this is rarely a good idea, but sometimes it is. So if you have a very specific topic and you have someone you want to work with, I think your goal should be to go find the advisor that will make you succeed in that type of work. In general, I think, to me, one of the most important things to look for is kind of the environment you're going to work with. So like one thing that I like, for example, where I am, is that we have a large group. There is a lot going on. And that's kind of what I had when I was a student at Penn. There was a large programming languages group versus maybe just one person working on a specific thing. So for me, this is very stimulating because I'm the type of person that likes to collaborate. So I think one thing that is important is often the individual advisor matters more than the specific institution. So if you want to go to a place just because it's high ranked or it's like the best university or whatnot, it might not necessarily be the best place for you for the type of work you want to do. So there are a couple of things you have to juggle. So there isn't a clear-cut answer. So you kind of have to figure out what are the important things for you. But typically, just going to the best place on paper is not a good idea. You want to go to the best place for the type of work you're interested in. I'll let someone continue, and then I can pick up on the second question.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add one thing, because I think it's a very different answer if you're applying in Europe. So I just wanted to add something along those lines. So in Europe, you usually apply for a specific project with a specific advisor. So you do have to make up your mind much earlier on in the process. Typically, PhD programs in Europe are 4 years, but they come with much less obligations in terms of teaching. So I do think if you have a very specific advisor in mind, and this advisor is in Europe, the strategy is slightly different than in the US. You should get in touch with the advisor. You should see if the advisor has funding and do a much more personal connection rather than pick a school. You're really picking an advisor. That's the only thing I wanted to add to what Lori said.
Just to follow up on that a little bit, the relationship you have with your advisor is going to be the most important aspect of how well you enjoy your graduate career. So in some situations, you are very much applying for a particular advisor at a particular institution or project. If in the US, where you do sort of apply more broadly to an institution rather than to specific advisors, cast a broad net. I guess even if you're applying to individual advisors, cast a broad net, because you never actually know what's going to be most exciting until you see what the options are. And if you have the opportunity to visit places, do that, because even if you go to 3 very similar looking institutions on paper, they might have completely different feels in the department. Talk to the faculty, talk to the graduate students, make sure they're happy, make sure that they enjoy what they're doing. If you have the option, go to places maybe that you would like to live in for a couple of years. It won't be the rest of your life, but you will have to spend time there. So you want to make sure that you'll be happy with not only the academics, but also with sort of your life in general.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that people have said here. So one thing that I want to emphasize is that doing your PhD, you need a lot of mentoring. And so look for great mentors. So the mentors can come in all shapes. I mean, it can be your advisor or your other professors or even your peer students. You can, so I mean, definitely talk to graduate students in that institution to see how well they are. I mean, how tightly knit they are. I mean, how much they're helping each other. All that matters a lot.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Actually, the current most popular question is a bit of a follow-up. What are the biggest mistakes possible future PhD students should avoid?
I think I have one. So I think one thing is that at least it's a tough lesson to learn, but one problem that you will face no matter what as a student or as a professor is that typically in 1 year you have 1 to 2 happy news and many sad news, meaning a couple of your papers get accepted. Those are the highlights of your year, let's say. It's May 6th and November 4th for whatever reason. And the rest of the year, often there will be sad news. However, when there are sad news, all your colleagues are getting happy news, and you have many, many, many colleagues. So one thing that will look like is that everybody's getting stuff in, everybody's getting happy stuff, awards and whatnot, and you are the only one that is getting nothing. Where the truth is that everybody's getting 2 a year, but you see your 2, and then you see everyone else's 2. So cumulatively, it looks like everyone is doing well, and you're the only one failing. So I think the biggest mistake is that I see many people unfortunately getting victim of is don't get affected by this if you can. It's just do the math, and everyone is having successes and failures. Just don't always think that you're the only one that is that everyone else is succeeding and you're not. So it's just the environment is such that you will always open Twitter and see everyone has gotten a best paper award, or has gotten a new paper, or has gotten a grant, or has gotten something. So this is normal. Everybody gets something once in a while. You also will get something once in a while. Focus on what you are doing. Don't focus on what other people are doing.
Yeah, I agree with Loris. I think that's great advice, not comparing yourself to others. It's sometimes hard to do, but good. I would add to that, do not underestimate the value of keeping healthy and having things outside work. I think, a happy researcher does better research, in my opinion. And I do think it's very important to take care of yourself, of your health, of your mental health, spend time with your friends if that's what you like, or find things that really keep you going in general. And another advice I would give, and it's a very personal take, only work with people you can see yourself being friends with. Do not, I think working with people, for instance, that are very negative or that your work ethics or manners are not the same can have a lot of, can put a lot of strain in your working relationship, but also in your overall happiness. So at some point in my career, I decided I would only work with people I could have a drink with. And it has worked well for me. So that would be one thing I would add.
Yeah, so it's, adding to what Alexander is saying, like, you have to trust yourself. I think if I look back at my PhD time and think some of the mistakes I made, a lot of them are because I didn't believe in myself. Like, you should realize that success comes in different ways. Like, it's the way your peers are successful is not going to look like the way you are going to be successful. So, ultimately, like, research is a creative process. And so everybody is going to be different by definition. So, so just have that and then believe in yourself. And also, like, going back to what Alexander is saying, creativity does not happen by spending 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? So you have to take time off in order to get new ideas. And so I wish somebody had told me that when I was doing my PhD. I mean, I realized much later that, you're actually helping yourself by taking care of yourself, spending time with your friends and having a lot of fun.
Yeah, I've had my best ideas when I wasn't in the office, and often when I wasn't even thinking, I was thinking about work. Don't be intimidated by more senior people in the field or by people who seem to be having more success than you. Odds are that they were in exactly the same shoes you were in when they were at your stage in their career. And I'm terrible at that. I still am totally stressed out talking to certain people in our area, and for absolutely no reason. But it's definitely something to think about and recognize very early on.
Thanks, everyone. Next question. During your PhD, how do you measure how well you're doing? Let's get back to this. If you can't measure by comparing with other people, then how do you measure?
So maybe I can say something on that. When I started my PhD, my advisor went on sabbatical like a few weeks after I started. And before he went on sabbatical, he gave me like 15 articles. This was at the time where people would still get printouts of their articles. So he just, in his office, in some shelf, he had all these printouts, and he just like started taking printouts and took a book and a bunch of stuff and gave me this pile of things and said, I'm gone for 4 months. When I come back, you should have read all of this and have some ideas on how to, how to go forward with the project. And those 4 months, I remember every single week questioning myself, how do I know that I'm making any progress? I mean, I'm reading these articles. I think I understand them, or at least, up to a point. And it was very, very strange. It really, really affected me because I was coming from I came directly from a bachelor in which we had tests and exams every other week. So every other week I would get some input on how well I was doing. And suddenly my advisor was even gone. I mean, I couldn't even talk to him. He just left that pile of things and said, read, and that's okay. Even if you don't produce anything, just read. And I think knowing how to live with that, how to live with the fact you don't get much input other than a few paper rejections once you start submitting papers, is actually part of growing into your PhD program. You really need to cope with the fact that input will be limited. Even if your advisor tells you you're doing okay, most of the times you will find it hard to believe it until you get a paper accepted. And you go long periods of time without having any validation from people on the outside. So it's really hard. And I still don't have a good answer on how you can really measure. I think it's very hard to put a measure on that.
Anyone has anything to add?
Yeah, so I mean, I can give you the other side of the. I mean, from my point of view, I like to give a lot of feedback to my students at least. Like at least, if not every week. I mean, every week I always say a word. It's like, oh, this was good. This was a productive meeting. We are moving forward. But at least once a month, I try to tell the student, you know, we are doing progress. This is good. Like things are going well. Or I can say sometimes, you know, this month has been a little bit slow. Is there something going on? Like you want to have a communication with your advisor. I think it's kind of, they are kind of the person that is better placed to evaluate how things are going. And in my case, I like to initiate this. But if you're a student and you feel like you don't know how things are going, just ask your advisor. It's like, I had some of my students do this once in a while. It's just like, I wanted to talk to you about things are going. Like, do you think, are we on track? Am I doing well enough? Is there something I should do better? Is there something that I'm, so it's like, it's very important to have a communication if possible. Yeah, the other thing is, we already said before, don't compare to other people. Everybody has a different path. Even in the same advisor, different students can have different projects. Some projects are more prone to have quick papers maybe at the beginning, versus some projects are more prone to requiring a long time to kind of get to something. It doesn't mean that you're not both progressing, you and the other student. It just means that you're progressing in different ways towards the goal. So it's very important to kind of, again, use your advisor as a person to communicate with, not just as a person to talk research to.
Thanks. So maybe we should move on to another question, unless someone has a burning comment. So the next question is, I find the more I learn about my field, the more I want to do everything. What do you think dabbling is bad for research-based career prospects?
Actually, not really. I think it's I think it's actually an advantage if you are broad, and you can actually operate on, like, you know, in the intersection of two fields. It can actually be an advantage to you, but at the same time, there's a limit to everything, right? I remember when I was a graduate student, it took me a while for me to even pick my graduate advisor, because I didn't know whether I wanted to do, like, systems or networking or databases or formal verification or theory. It took me a while to actually even figure what I wanted to do. A little bit of like exploration is good, but spending too much time figuring out what you want to do is also at the same time not good.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess I've always thought of my time being structured into the time to focus on sort of my priorities and what I want to do research on. And then for me, it's often the opposite problem, which is I don't give myself enough time for the wacky ideas and to learn new things and to read outside of my area. But both are equally important to do. It might require discipline to sort of reach a balance, and the balance is going to be different from everybody. But having broad interests is important. And it could just be that as you naturally go through graduate school or progress in your career, you're going to find yourself becoming more and more excited about a small number of different topics to focus on. So I wouldn't worry too much about feeling like a dabbler. But in the back of your mind, you also want to think about that in order to really have an impact and be productive in the sort of the sense of maybe how other people in the field would define productivity, you do want to at some point sort of really think about what you're most excited about. It often means combining things in interesting ways. So you might still feel like you're dabbling, but you're actually making progress on something very particular to what you're excited about.
Thanks. So the next popular question is, what are some things to talk about when talking to random people at conferences? And I saw a related question below was basically about how do you approach people at conferences that you don't know, and is it okay to talk to them even if you don't know much about their research? So basically generally commenting on talking to people at conferences.
Yes, it's absolutely okay to talk to them. As someone who's been to many conferences over the last 20 or 25 years, I just assume people are going to want to come and talk to me. And there's nothing special about me. I think everybody in the room feels the same way. We're an academic community, and that means that we enjoy talking about ideas and enjoy learning what other people are doing. So you should never feel uncomfortable about that. I guess to go to the specific question about what to talk about, asking what somebody's working on is always a good way to get them talking. You might feel like this is a person I should probably already know what they're working on, but it's okay if you don't, because there are enough people at conferences that we really don't know what everybody else is working on. Asking what type of institution they're at or how they balance their different aspects of their work. All of these things are valid questions, and going to some of the other things that we've talked about are a really good way to sort of explore all of the opportunities that are out there for you.
Yeah, and I think everybody loves talking about their research. So I think this is always a good, I mean, if let's say you're meeting somebody very senior or somebody who's well-known, the best way to talk to them is actually talk to them about what they are thinking about. They love to talk about it. So it's a good icebreaker.
Yeah, another icebreaker is to ask people what they've enjoyed so far at that conference, especially younger researchers who might feel less comfortable talking about what they're doing. You can ask about which talks they've enjoyed or what activities they've been to and things like that. Sometimes small talk at coffee breaks helps than making the step to potentially, if you have more serious questions about their research.
Another thing that you can discuss is somehow bringing your research is like, I mean, if it's somebody, for example, that, you know, does work that is vaguely related to what you're doing, you can say, hi, I've been wanting to meet you because I think we work in related fields. I'm particularly excited about this thing I'm doing now. I wanted to tell you about it. And usually they'll be happy to hear about that. And another easy icebreaker, I mean, this only applies for during the actual conference, is if you've gone to someone's talk, you can start with nice talk. I really enjoyed it. Where are you taking this next? Is this project going? I don't know. You can basically build on what you've already seen. But what everyone else said is all very good.
All right, thanks. Great tips. Next question. If you already have a particular potential advisor in mind whom you want to work with, what are the do's and don'ts while contacting them?
Yes, that depends a lot on the advisor as well. But one thing I would say, don't feel that you have to show that you know more than you do at that stage. I mean, advisors know that when you're coming into talk about potentially starting a PhD, your knowledge, your in-depth knowledge is not there, and no one expects it to be there. So don't try to show you know more than you do, and don't be afraid of asking questions about how the actual project might look like, or you know, what type of questions the advisor is interested to look at. It's good to find out what questions excite the advisor. And then if those questions, I mean, the advisor will have experience to formulate those questions at a level that even people with just a bit of knowledge will understand. And if those questions excite you, then you know you have a good match. And if you already have ideas on what project you would like to do, you can also try to explain it, but you don't need to like show that you've already done X, Y, or Z, because no one expects that at that stage. So that would be my advice, to keep the conversation very grounded on the things that excite you and excite the potentially excite the advisor.
And especially for sort of emailing somebody the first time, a potential advisor, keep it short and to the point, just to ensure that the advisor will actually think about and be able to respond. If you have 15 questions you'd like to ask them, try to hold back until you know that they're actually hiring students or taking on new students the next year, because that one question might be something that you'll hear back from very quickly. But if you ask a lot, it might be hard for somebody to actually carve out the time to send you back all the information you want, even if they're very well intentioned and would like to. There's always time later for developing that relationship. But what you really want to do is just establish that you're really interested in what they do, are curious whether or not they would be interested in working with you, and maybe what the next step would be, or if it would be okay to follow up with a couple of other questions, or get in touch with a graduate student that's working with them that could help out too, something like that.
Just to follow up on that, I think it's great advice. Another thing that you might not realize when you contact the advisor is that it might be easier to ask them to follow up with an half-an-hour Skype or Zoom meeting than answering a very long email. So if you think there's a match, it might be easier to actually for the person to carve out half an hour of their schedule to have an interaction with you, rather than that person having to find your email among the 50 emails they got that day and then spend half an hour carving out a well-composed answer. People are usually more responsive during a conversation than they will be in responding to emails.
So, I mean, I think one point that perhaps was only briefly mentioned, to me, the most important thing, we receive a lot of emails essentially of people that want to do some kind of work. And to me, the tricky bit is figuring out who's actually serious. And why do you want to work with me versus everyone else in the world? So for me, that why is the most important part. So what I look for in the email when you email me is, why me? Why my papers? Which papers did you read of mine? Which work of mine excites you? Because we get lots of emails like, oh, I'm very interested in working with you, and there is no reason why. It's just, I'm interested in working with you. That's not a good reason. You have to tell me, like, what is of my work that excites you? And usually when I see that signal, that's when I say we should talk more. So I think it's just that bit that's somewhere in there to say, like, I love when I get an email and somebody says, I read this paper of yours. I found it really intriguing. I have to admit, I didn't understand all the parts because I'm still a junior student, but I really like where this research is going, and I would like to work on something related to this. So that's something, a signal that you're actually interested in my work, versus it's very clear if a student has just skimmed through my webpage and copy a link of a title and say, this is an interesting paper. So it's just like, make it clear that you're actually serious.
Great advice, thanks. Let's proceed to the next question. I'm a pre-final year undergraduate from India and currently contributing to an open source compilers project. How to proceed in order to get a job to work on compilers and programming languages? So it doesn't really specify what kind of job, but maybe you can comment on the various different possibilities.
So I can, yeah, it's I think depends on the kind of job. If you want an industry like software engineering job, the answer is different from whether you want to actually pursue a research career. If you want to apply for a software engineering job, you contact you apply to the company. I can't think of anything else specific to say. If there is somebody with whom you want to work, you can actually contact them. Like, for example, you can contact me to see if, hey, are there positions open in Microsoft? I would be, I get those emails all the time, and I try my best to redirect them to, appropriate groups. And you can try doing that to other people that you might have met in conferences or who might know in other places, to actually send them your resume and reach them out. That's actually a good way for, getting your work known within the company.
All right. Thanks, Madan. I think we can move on to the next question. The panel ratio is split 3-to-1 between academia and industry. As a PL student, I'm curious, are there more jobs in academia for prospective PL researchers?
I mean, I think not. I think that would be the short answer. Yeah, I think, but Nadia should correct me. I think they try to have a diverse panel according to certain criteria that would include at least the industry option and several shapes of academia. But I don't think you should take the ratio of this panel as the ratio of jobs. I do think the ratio of industry jobs is probably 3/4. I don't know. I'm making up the number. Maybe Madan has a more.
So I can just say that, this has been a great time to be a computer scientist and specifically a PL person. There are lots of opportunities both in industry, industrial research, and in academia. I think you should not look at, in all these three, different tracks have their own advantages and disadvantages. I think it's more important for you to figure out where you want to go than figuring out where you can go, right? And I think there are lots of opportunities out here. And so I think it's more important that you figure out where you want to go.
I see Emery responded on Slack. I think he's commenting on Slack as we go, saying that there are 5,000 universities and colleges in the US. So I think he's trying to say that the ratio is better than I was indicating. But
I think that the numbers here are more like there are, among all the PL people who complete a PhD, some number wants to go to academia and the other ones don't. So the ones that don't, I think they're just going to industry. And the ones that do want to do academia, again, I guess then the question becomes how many of them succeed at that goal? And I don't have an exact number, but I can tell you that the situation these days is very, very good compared to the situation 15 years ago. So that's perhaps to substantiate when Madan said it's a very good time to be doing work in this field, regardless of what career opportunity you have in mind.
I think some people are, let me chime in just with a question from, with a follow-up. So I think some people are concerned that if you are interested in PL, but you go to industry, you won't end up doing something that's very specific to PL, but rather will end up doing something generic. So maybe Madan, if you have anything to comment on.
So yeah, so first of all, I think you have to distinguish between whether you want a research career or a software engineering career. I think those are the big, choices that you have to make. And once you make that choice on whether you want to do a research career, then you can say whether you want to be in academia or you want to be in an industrial research organization. I think those are the choices. And so the big difference between pursuing a research career and, you can do cool work, whether you're a software engineer in a tech company or you're pursuing research, right? I think that the requirements are different. Research is more open-ended. You're pushing on your own ideas. You're discovering new things. You're trying to come up with creative ways to solve problems. I think in a software engineering career, there's still a lot of creativity. You get to work on big projects, but you're part of something big, and you don't have a way to carve out, a space for yourself unless you're more senior. So those are the big difference in career choices between research and in in a non-research position. So I think, it was not very clear from your question whether you meant when you said PL researchers can still choose to take a non-research career. So it was not very clear whether you wanted to talk more specifically about industry and academia in the research division. But let's say you want to pursue a research career, then I think probably we can have, then the panel represents, the options available. I think there are a lot more options available in academic research institute, because as Emery pointed out, there are way more academic institutions where you can do research than industrial research organizations. So about the distinctions, we could, we can, there are lots of differences, subtle differences. Like, for example, in academia, you're doing research through, where you're working more with your students, while in an industrial research organization, your research happens more through collaboration with colleagues. So there are subtle differences based on that. But other than that, I think the general theme is still, you're doing open-ended research. You want to, solve hard problems and so on. Yeah.
Thanks, Manan.
By
the way,
I just wanted to add a minor thing that, like, one kind of job that is becoming more prominent in the last years that maybe wasn't as much 20 years ago is that many companies now, they have sort of language engineers, which are software engineers that are very specific training based on programming languages. And a lot of people that I know ended up choosing that career path. And for example, compiler, Apple has a huge compiler team, Google has a huge compiler team. So you can go do work that is still very much programming languages work. It's just you're not going to publish papers, but it's still very exciting work.
Great. Thanks, Loris. By the way, the plan is to go until 1:15 just because of the technical difficulties. We started late, but if anyone has a problem with that on the panel, then you can speak up now. All right, great. So let's just go through. There's so many questions. There's no way we're going to get through all of them. So I just go by popularity. The next most popular question is it a good idea to stay with the same advisor after PhD as a postdoc, or one should move to a different advisor and institution?
I can start. It's a terrible idea to stay with your advisor. You should always, whenever you have the chance, go somewhere else. It's like, as I said, like a lot of what's going to happen in your career is just the number of opportunities that you carve out for yourself. And staying with your advisor officially just means that you've increased your PhD length by a couple of years. You haven't explored anything new. And I think it's very important also. I know a lot of people have a little bit of often fear of trying something new, and it's very hard. We all have it. Like change is always scary, but I feel like change often is a good thing in terms of changing advisor, changing location, changing collaborator, or even sometimes going into a topic that is not something you're exactly familiar with. It can be scary, but I think it's always a learning opportunity. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, I imagine the panel will be pretty unanimous on this one. So I'll just.
I would like to add something to that.
Okay.
I mean, I do agree in principle, but I do think that if we want to make the field more inclusive, we have to also accept that for some people, moving is not an option. And so I think there are many other ways to diversify your research and your collaborators, even if you end up staying for a 1-year postdoc or 2-year postdoc at the institution where you graduated. So even though, yes, in principle, it is good to go elsewhere, I think we have to take into account that for some people that's not possible. And I would like to stress that that doesn't mean it's a complete no-go for a career, both in academia or in industry for that matter. I do think it requires a little bit of creativity in managing your personal situation and at the same time maybe diversify your network of collaborators. But I do believe PL as a field strives to be inclusive, and I do believe we do relatively well in promoting also a good work-life balance. So I do think if people feel they cannot move, there are other ways to get the right level of diversity in your CV.
Thanks, Alexandra. There's another question about industry jobs. For jobs related to research positions in industry, how much focus should be given to hardcore coding skills versus your research acumen?
Your research acumen is probably the first order important thing.
All right, I guess that was a quick question, unless someone wants to add something. next one, what is the right way to approach an external mentor for our career? There is always a fear to share our weaknesses with someone who might be hiring us in the future.
I'm not sure I understand the question in terms of what the weaknesses are. So I mean, in general, the way to approach the mentor is that you should just talk about, as we said before, about like why it's like I suspect here he's talking again about, I'm not sure what is an external mentor.
Maybe I can take this one, Lori, at least to start.
Yeah.
So first, I think this idea that sharing weaknesses is a weakness might be one of those fears that once you start talking to someone, you realize it's not quite a weakness. It's actually, most of the time, if people are aware of their weaknesses, that's a strength. So that's one thing I would highlight. Second, I think when you go to conferences and you meet someone senior that you connect with at some level, even if it's over your love of breaking bread or something, and they have developed their career in a way that you think, this is a place where I would like to go, it is very good for your own career to actually ask, how did you get there? And to, if you have fears, you should share them, because maybe it's not clear to you, but those people had the exact same fears. So even though it might look scary, I would try not to be afraid of sharing what you might see as weaknesses, because most of the time they are not really weaknesses. And I do think for mentors, it is important that you connect with people that you can see yourself in a few years. That would be my advice when you're seeking mentors outside your direct network.
So adding on to that, yes, I think you should be as open as possible with your mentors, and it's a very personal relationship. I think mentor-mentee relationship works the more open you are, and so what I have done in specific cases is that when somebody whom who have been my mentee who are interviewing, I'm conflicted on both sides, right? Because I really like that person. That's why I've spent a lot of time mentoring this person, and so I sort of stay away from the interview process as much as possible without creating any biases either way against or for that person. And so I don't think you should worry about your career decisions. I think it's going to be strictly helpful to have a strong mentor-mentee relationship.
And I think everybody on the panel, it's safe to say, has had strong mentors throughout their careers. And again, I've mentioned this in a couple of their answers, but take advantage of the resources that are available to you. And that includes chatting with other people in the field. We recognize how important mentoring is, since we've all benefited from it. And it shouldn't be awkward to talk to us about anything or seek guidance from people outside of your immediate circle. It might not be easy the first few times you do it, but I think it is important, and it can only be a good thing.
All right. I think on this note, we might just wrap up, because there's no way we're going to get through all of these questions for sure. But and this was a great one to end on. I would like you to join me in thanking our amazing panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks for investing your time, and I hope you'll stick around and hang around on Slack and Disco.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It was a lot of fun, by the way.
Yeah, it was very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you, the organizer.
Thanks, Nadia.
Thanks, everyone. And bye.